Hello and welcome to Whisky Project. My name is Amit,
My name is Suj.
and today we are going to talk about the origin and the current state of whiskey. So it's about the past and present of whiskey. So let's buckle up and go.
So, whiskey producers have always debated, there's always been a debate between the Irish and the Scottish as to who invented or gave birth to whiskey. Now, when you think about, liquor, the making of liquor dates back to 800 AD when Middle Eastern chemist Abu Musa Jabir ibn Hayyan was carrying out distillation. So, distillation is simply the process of purifying a fermented beverage. So it dates back to 800 AD, and it's the Middle East who basically started the process of distillation. Now, according to late English whiskey author Michael Jackson, in his
Not the
book,
Michael Jackson who basically
no,
sings
no,
and dances.
not the moonwalk guy. Called in his book called The Definitive World Guide, talks about a family of physicians named the McAvoys, or they were also known as the Beatons. He talks about how they were able to translate ancient Arabic script and were able to use that for making spirits in Scotland. Now, the first written record of distillation in Scotland dates back to 1495 during the reign of King James IV. Now, during that time, distilled spirit was called aqua vitae. And in the 1500s is when they started calling it ushkaba. So it was referred to as ushkaba, which basically is a flavored up spirit. And flavored up spirit was basically, it was flavored from herbs in the garden. And for the rest 200 years, it remained the same. So till the 19th century, that is what it was called.
Oh, wow. So it's good you mentioned that because I think I remembered reading something about this debate about who made whiskey,
Yeah.
Scottish or Irish.
Yeah.
And I think it's one of these books that I was reading the other day. I think this is this one. Let me just see. It's called Whisky Opus. So this book is written by Gavin Smith and Dominic Roskrow. I think it was in the introduction somewhere. There you go. So there is a chapter in the introduction which says who invented whiskey.
Okay.
And in there, there are some people in the industry who have basically said what they think the origins of whiskey is. So Barry Crockett, who's the master distiller of Middleton Distillery in Ireland, says Samuel Morwood, in his 1838 publication, A History of Inebriating Liquors, offers two thoughts, both of which suggest the importance of Ireland to the invention of whiskey. Now, firstly, he speculated that if Egyptians or other Asiatics were acquainted with the distillation process, it is likely they would have introduced it into Ireland. And secondly, he refers to a statement by the Roman writer Tacitus that the ports and the landing places in Hibernia, which is Ireland, were better known than those of Britain. So that's why Ireland. It's more likely that it would have come from the Middle East to Ireland than to Britain. It is now taken that the skill of distillation was developed in Mesopotamia, and that the practice and knowledge was brought to the West. Merchants and other travelers used existing trade routes, and it is reasonable to suggest that the practice came from North Africa to Ireland.
Interesting.
Yeah, and it is not possible to state who actually invented whiskey. We come back to square one. But the practice came to such prominence in Ireland that the name aqua vitae, which means water of life, became ushkaba, as you just mentioned, from which the word whiskey actually is derived. John Campbell, distillery manager at Lefroig, says, I have heard it dates back as far back as 8000 BC to the ancient Chinese. Most cultures have used the same technology and the natural ingredients from the land to flavor the product. Closer to home, Cameron Syme, who is the managing director of the Great Southern Distilling Company in Australia, basically where lime burners whiskies come from. He says the history, as I understand it, is that the Irish applied distillation technology to fermented grain. It was a matter of necessity to help preserve surplus grain. The Scots were the ones who really took it further and applied the concept more broadly. The distillation technologies supposedly came out of the Middle East. Again, the same pattern. But does anyone really know who invented whiskey? I am glad that someone did, and we are glad too. A funny one, I think, in the mix is it comes from Gary Tosh, who is the global brand manager at Highland Park Distillery in Orkney in Scotland. He says, "We trained an Irish monk to make whiskey and told him to keep it a secret, or we would eventually have to pay taxes on it. He couldn't keep it quiet." So there you go. So it basically sums up what you were talking about.
So you can't really pin it down to one person or one country. When you think about the McAvoys, the physicians, they used to work for both the Irish and the Scots. So let's just call it a tie. So because it's still murky, let's call it a tie. So let's talk about what whiskey looks like now. So we spoke about whiskey from the 19th century. So what does the current landscape of whiskey look like now?
Yeah, actually, it's a great progression from where it was and where it is now. And now is a great time for whiskey. As you can almost see around you, it's just burgeoned. The demand is so high that whiskey distillers are finding it difficult to actually maintain a supply or match supply to demand. A great example would be Japanese whiskey, wouldn't it be?
Yamazaki's,
exactly. Suntory and other Japanese whiskey which were favorites are just literally getting drained. They're coming up with statements saying their age statement whiskeys would be discontinued. It basically says something about the people who actually started distilling or maturing the whiskey in Japan. They didn't think of this spike of demand, spike in demand of whiskey. So that's why they're having a hard time to actually find old casks to put a number or an age statement on their product. So it's a great example of saying how the demand has grown. And it's not only grown in Australia specifically or Europe or Scotland, it's all over the world. There are whiskey distilleries propping up all over the world. In Asia, parts of Asia, like Taiwan, Japan is coming up with new distilleries. India is coming up with new distilleries. Even Scotland is growing its own distillery base. Macallan has built a new distillery which can produce so much more quantity compared to its earlier or the older distillery capacity. Then you have places in Europe producing new whiskey in new distilleries. Scandinavia, France, Sweden in Scandinavia, for example. So saying that, it's a great time for whiskey producers. The sales are up. As I said, they can't produce enough for the market. Now, how many whiskey shows have we been to?
In this year, maybe 6 or 7?
6 already, 6, 7 already. These are big whiskey shows. And then on top of it, several whiskey tasting events. So it all kind of is a indication to the popularity of whiskey today. So what is interesting is looking at why, the reasons behind this popularity. Two main reasons come to the fore. One is this insatiable interest in single malt, particularly single malt whiskeys all around the world again. And the second one is pure economics. The middle class in emerging economies like the BRIC economies of Brazil, Russia, India and China, they are growing, so they have now the purchasing power to actually buy whiskey, and they're choosing whiskey over other spirits, and that is one of the major reasons why. And they're doing it for the middle class. They're seeking to enjoy the rewards to their newly acquired wealth. And when it comes to alcohol, there are few drinks like whiskey which can match, as a symbol of attainable wealth and luxury. So that's the reason why. in the same kind of the reason is the new trend in the West, where the trend is to drink less but better. So high quality drink, but less in quantity. So these are the two reasons why. And all this is basically pushing whiskey makers and distillers to experiment. They're experimenting with, because people now are not increasingly are flavor driven. What it means is they want new flavors all the time, like port cask matured, rum cask matured, and all these different flavor demands, as opposed to just drinking to get drunk, which was kind of a few years back. Is pushing whiskey distillers to come up with, experiment with different wood types, different cask finishes, different drying techniques, peat, different grains. Like I heard millet is being used to produce whiskey. Like who would have thought?
Yeah, exactly.
Like because that's a different flavor that was not there. So
and it's not just the demand for whiskey has also benefited ancillary industries as well. You think about glasswares. No one spoke about glasswares. Everyone used to drink in old-fashioned glasses. But in the last maybe 10 to 20 years, glasswares have come into prominence. You think of the amount of glassware that's available now, and we'll obviously talk more about glassware and how it changes or changes the whole experience of whiskey drinking in our future episodes. But glassware has been a big industry in the last 10 to 20 years. Another one is cabinet making. You talk about whiskey being a status symbol. A lot of people want to display their whiskeys, and there's a room for customization there as well. So that's been another industry that has really benefited. But I think the industry that has benefited the most is probably the whiskey auction houses. They've been around for a long time, but in the last 20 years, they've seen a sudden increase in demand for their services, because there's a secondary market now for people who want to acquire rare whiskies. So that's been, a big blessing for whiskey auction houses. One particular auction house, probably one of the biggest ones, does probably about 3,000 bottles a month on an average.
Wow.
Yeah, which is ridiculous. So the demand has increased drastically in the last few years.
Which is great for both consumers and collectors.
True.
So,
So that was our episode on the past and present of the whiskey landscape. In a future episode, we're going to talk about 3 fundamental questions of whiskey. So, what is whiskey? Why whiskey and not any other spirit? And how is whiskey made? So stay tuned and make sure you like, subscribe, and follow us on our socials and YouTube and Facebook. Also follow us on our website, which is www.whiskyproject.com. Also join our notification squad by clicking on the bell icon on our videos. See you next time. Thank you, guys.
See you next time. Thank you.
Was it the Scottish or was it the Irish?
Just
reading too much. Reading too much.
Yeah. Just in that reason as well.
And also, make sure you go onto our website. Also, you can join. Make sure also to follow our.
We trained an Irish monk to make whiskey and told him to keep it secret, or we would eventually have to pay taxes on it. He just couldn't keep it quiet.
In our future episodes, we're going to cover 3 fundamental questions in whiskey. What, how, and why. Or what, why, and how.